yesterday, just to recapitulate very quickly, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, we discussed the three bardos, the bardo of the moment of death, the second bardo, which is what the Tibetans call experiencing reality, that has all the 100 wrathful and peaceful deities in it. And the third bardo, which was the bardo of rebirth. So now that we have at least somewhat of a foundation with respect to this book, we were now, and today we're going to head into the writings of HPB and the adepts, particularly the adepts Morya and Kuthumi, who wrote about the theosophical view of what happens to people between the transition between the time that they die and the time that they are reborn. The same, essentially, as what this book does. These views, as you're going to see today, do not align perfectly, but that there are some very interesting cross currents and comparisons to make. So with that, we'll begin. There is a solitary and solemn journey inevitably made by every human being repeatedly, which traverses the metaphysical states between the exit of death and the entrance of rebirth. Collectively, these post-mortem journeys, these journeys through the night, may be said to be the nights of our cosmic migration through eons of major and minor cycles of spiritual evolution. Just as our corporeal or incarnate lives from birth to death may be said to be its days. Compared to the days of these cycles, the incarnate lifetimes, little specific has been written or is widely known of the nights, the post-mortem existence. What has been written of them establishes that both these days and nights are subject to the dual, immutable laws of one, periodicity, the eternal cyclic motion, and two, karma, the invariable law of immediate causes, the law of compensation. Based on these universal laws, we also know that these days and nights affect each other as two co-equal sides of one cyclic continuum. One of the rare treatises on the postmodern journey of human beings expressly predicated on these two immutable laws, periodicity and karma, is the Bardo Thodol, this book which has been translated into English, as I mentioned yesterday, by the Dalai Lama and his group. And this is the Bardo Thodol, a Tibetan text whose literal translation is the great liberation through hearing, but which has come to be known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. This presentation today, being the second of two parts, requires some familiarity with the Bardo Thodol in order to make it meaningful, and we hope that we've achieved a little of that in the lecture, the first presentation on Sunday. This familiarity is necessary because chief among the aims of this presentation today is to compare the 14th century Bardo Thodol, this book, to the 19th century writings of those who were primarily responsible for establishing the Theosophical Society. These would certainly include the writings of H.P. Blavatsky, but more significantly include the writings of two adepts who were her teachers, Morya and Kuthumi, initiates of an order of spiritually advanced individuals. The writings of these two adepts, in the form of letters, will be taken from the Mahatma letters to A.P. Sin. Two further introductory remarks will alert you to what you might consider extraneous references made in certain of the quotes below that you will hear me read by these 19th century theosophical regarders regarding the post-mortem journey of the transmigrant, the human monad, and its related principles. First among these, what I've referred to as extraneous references, are references to spiritualism, popular at the time, whose practices involved human shells of the post-mortem states, and which was the subject of considerable discourse among members of the TS during the 1870s and 1880s. The second such references are those to cycles of the evoluting life force, of which humans are the apex, and covering globes, rounds, and kalpas, involving immense spans of times within recurring and periodic cycles of extant manifestation known in Sanskrit as manvantaras, and their polar opposites of non-existence, known in Sanskrit as pralayas. Quotations by these 19th century theosophical writers appearing below will occasionally contain wording that relates to spiritualism or to this cosmic periodicity. While these two subjects are too extensive to be meaningfully treated here, both do have some bearing on the post-mortem states. So you are hereby alerted to the presence of such references in certain quotes that follow, and if you wish, can pursue your own study of these subjects. So now we're going to come to a subject heading called variable terminology. The Bardo Thodol provides no single invariable term of art for the surviving element of the human being that reincarnates and keeps reincarnating until liberation from the wheel of death and rebirth is achieved. In stark contrast to this omission, the 19th century theosophical writers provide several terms for this surviving element, which presents another set of issues. This difference may be due in part to the fact that unlike the 14th century Tibetans who used no term, invariable or otherwise, for the surviving element of the human being, the 19th century theosophical writers drew upon multiple traditions that did have such terms, from the Vedanta to the Kabbalists to the Egyptians, among others. This method necessarily led these writers to employ and compare multiple terms from different languages for the same principle, with such comparisons all being further subject to variations in and the fallibility of translations. In naming the immortal surviving element of the human being, the adepts Maurya and Kuthumi appear to have preferred the term spiritual ego or immortal ego, while HPB appears to have preferred the term monad. Though by no means were these usages exclusive. In fact, these two terms were occasionally used interchangeably by the adepts and HPB. Speaking precisely to this point, Kuthumi wrote to A.P. Sinnott that, quote, "I am sorry you do not find her, HPB's, answer written under my direct inspiration very satisfactory, for it proves to me only that up to this you have not yet grasped very firmly the difference between the sixth and seventh and the fifth principles, or the immortal and the astral, or personal egos equals monads." Actually, it's monads equals egos. But it's significant that he actually used equals, the equal sign in the text of his letter. So I think in his mind, I mean, there wasn't a whole lot of difference between his preferred usage of immortal ego and HPB's usage of monad. And they each did use those terms themselves as well. For her part, HPB provides a useful definition of monad in the Theosophical Glossary. It reads, quote, "the unity, the one." But in occultism, it often means the unified triad, Atma, Buddhi, Manas, or the duad, Atma, Buddhi, that immortal part of man which reincarnates in the lower kingdoms and gradually progresses through them to man and then to the final goal, nirvana. End quote. That's HPB's definition of monad in the glossary. Though these terms differ in their usage of spiritual ego, the adepts convey the same meaning as in HPB's definition of monad, and it must be emphasized that none of these terms stands apart from, but are fully integrated with the doctrine of the 7 principles of the human being. As the Mahatma Maurya stated, quote, "Man has his 7 principles, the germs of which he brings with him at birth," end quote. This core doctrine of the 7 principles is foundational to an understanding of both the immortal element in the human being that survives death and appears in future incarnations, and the journey through the night of the post-mortem states, from death to rebirth. This doctrine of the 7 principles is too extensive to treat in detail here, but at least a cursory overview is warranted for understanding as clearly as possible the post-mortem transition as described by the 19th century theosophical writers and the comparisons between their views and those set forth in the Bardo Thodol. So now we're coming to a subheading on the 7 principles and a definition, and we're going to drill down a little bit into the 7 principles. The higher principles of the human being can be understood by reference to the Vedantic formulation of 5 pancha, constituent koshas or bodies, alternatively translated as sheaths or vehicles or envelopes, of the human being, as found in the Taittiriya Upanishad. We may add to these translations the word principles. So now you have sheaths, vehicles, envelopes, and principles, and also bodies. For the 3 higher koshas, principles being the term of choice for HPB and the adepts. Referred to as the higher triad, the highest 3 koshas, or principles, are the Anandamaya kosha, which may also be termed the Atma, the Vijnayamaya kosha, which may also be termed the Buddhi, and the Manomaya kosha, often termed the Manas. Now these are right from the Vedas, okay? The Vedantic Atma, Buddhi, Manas koshas align exactly with the 3 higher principles of the 19th century theosophical writers. And these writers consistently follow the order in their writings that the Atma, Buddhi, and Manas are the 7th, 6th, and 5th principles. The lower 4 of these 7 principles, or the, quote, the lower quaternary versus the higher triad, meaning then a sum of 7, the lower 4 does not as easily lend itself to comparisons with either of the Vedantic concepts of kosha described above, or to sharira, also translated as body, of which there are 3. Sharira is another system within the Vedantic material that describes bodies or koshas, and there are actually several of them. The exceptions to this are the Shluthla Sharia, the gross physical body, which is the first of the septenary principles, the first principle, and the Linga Sharia, a subtle counterpart of the physical body composed of energy known as akasa, and the second of the septenary principles. So you have the physical body and the akasic or etheric body, what's 1 and 2. The third of these principles, composed of fohat energy, is consistently referred to as jivatma, or the life principle, by all the 19th century theosophical writers, HPB and the adepts together. Similarly, the 4th lower principle is referred to as the kamarupa, and is the center of desire, emotion, energy, and volition, or will. It may seem from this that the adepts in HPB arbitrarily pull Sanskrit terms from extant systematic Vedantic doctrines in order to arrive at a terminology of their own to describe the septenary principles of human beings. But Sanskrit had had and has an existing vocabulary for them. And while those early Vedantic systems of kosha and sharira were memorialized in writing eons ago and describe other composite features of human beings, no such discrete system was complete in terms of conveying the facts of the septenary organization that HPB and the adepts used throughout their writings. So basically they compiled those portions, I believe, of the old Vedantic systems that were available to them, and they chose the first three and a few of the four and then created the septenary, because there aren't any that I know of, any septenary systems in the Vedanta. So this, essentially, one could see this as a correction to those old Sanskrit texts about the principles of humankind. But that's, I'm just guessing here, I don't know that. Okay. No such discrete system was complete in terms of conveying the facts of the septenary organization that HPB and the adepts used throughout their writings, and which pertain directly to the transition of the monad through the post-mortem states. Perhaps the most comprehensive statement on these 7 principles was made by Moria when he wrote that, and this is a long quote, "Thus the body of man is wedded to and remains forever within the body of this planet." So that's the first principle, the body. His individual jivatma life principle, that which is called in physiology animal spirits, returns after death to its source, fohat. That's the third principle. His linga shariram will be drawn into akasa. That's the second principle. He's not going in order here, as you can see. His kamarupa will recommingle with the universal sakti, the will force, or universal energy. That's the fourth principle. His animal soul, borrowed from the breath of universal mind, will return to the Dayan koans. That's the fifth principle. His sixth principle, whether drawn into or ejected from the matrix of the great passive principle, must remain in its own sphere, either as part of the crude material or as an individualized entity to be reborn in a higher world of causes. That's the buddhi, the sixth principle. Finally, the seventh principle will carry it from the devashan and follow the new ego to its place of rebirth. So that, in a nutshell, is the Mahatma Maurya's statement about the 7 principles. One last and crucial observation about these principles needs highlighting, which is that the 5th principle, manas, or mind, is bifurcated, cut in two, between the lower mind, the seat of ordinary thoughts, and the higher mind, the seat of abstract and or spiritual thought. In esoteric literature, these two aspects of manas, sometimes referred to as rupa, lower, and arupa, higher, are separated by a subtle divide known as the antakarana. For our purposes, it is indispensable to understand that for most during the post-mortem journey, the arupa, the higher mind, or in any event, the highest portions of it, joins the 6th and 7th principles, buddhi and atma, and together, these 3 form the spiritual monad, the immortal surviving element of the human being that reincarnates. That's the discussion on the 7 principles. Now we'll go to discuss the Buddhist principle, and for that matter, it's sort of a generalized Sanskrit term, so one sees reference to this in Hinduism as well, but these are referred to as the skandhas. So this section is the skandhas and the 7 principles. Above, we recounted the fact that the Bardo Thodol provides no single invariable term of art for the surviving element of the human being that reincarnates. While it may seem odd that a treatise which seeks to detail the processes that occur in the transition from death to rebirth has no specific term for that which actually makes this journey and reincarnates. This likely points to a tension between the early Buddhist dogma of anatta, a Pali term usually translated as no self or non-self, and the more esoteric and later Tantra tradition of the Vajrayana Buddhism of Tibet. So what I believe is that the very early Buddhist dogma of anatta and the later Vajrayana Tibetan Buddhist texts of most of the Vajrayana sutras and tantras have this kind of tension in them. The theosophical student of the Bardo Thodol must therefore acknowledge the acquiescence of the text to this dogmatic tenet. In other words, I think the Bardo Thodol is acquiescing to the ancient dogma of anatta by not providing an actual term for identifying that which makes the journey and reincarnates. So the theosophical student must therefore acknowledge the acquiescence of the text to this dogmatic tenet of Buddhism and therefore actively infer the existence of a surviving element of the human being for the sake of logic, if for no other reason. The Bardo Thodol does, however, employ the Buddhist doctrine of the skandhas, a Sanskrit term variously translated variously as aggregates or groupings, which posits 5 elements, or perhaps, if you prefer, 5 principles. 5 elements or phenomena that comprise the whole of an individual's physical and mental existence. The 5 skandhas are, in order, 1, rupa, the gross physical body, and not to be confused with the rupa of the lower mind. They're different, same term used for different things here. Number 2, the vedana, sensations or sensate feelings. Number 3, shamsna, perceptions of the senses. Number 4, samskaras, ordinary mental formations or conceptions. And 5, vijnana, awareness or consciousness. Now, I need to point out here that I borrowed these translations from a text on the skandhas that I have, and reading other texts on the same thing, and I sort of tailored them, but one finds various translations of the skandhas in different sources, just to let you know that. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, first complete translation, the term skandha is translated as aggregate and is defined as, quote, and this is a definition in the glossary of this book, okay? So it is defined as, quote, a general philosophical term referring to the 5 principal psychophysical components which constitute the mind-body complex of a sentient being, end quote. The aggregates, or skandhas, appear in the text of the Bardo Thodol in 5 instances, each related to one of the 5 peaceful deities encountered by the deceased in the Chösnyen or second Bardo. The aggregates are said to be liberated, effectively extinguished, along with those among the deceased who in fact achieve liberation in the Bardos from the wheel of death and rebirth. So if somebody is fortunate enough to achieve liberation in the process of transition through the Bardos, which is, as we know, the sort of goal of the Bardo Thodol, then the skandhas are just extinguished in that process of liberation. As long as liberation is not attained in the earlier Bardos, the remaining skandhas of decedents undergo gradual dissolution in the later Bardos, while the surviving transmigrant, which is unnamed in this book, in the Bardo Thodol, continues onward to rebirth. If the skandhas, therefore, presents somewhat of an incomplete picture as to what part of the human being disintegrates, or what part may survive throughout the post-mortem journey. This incompletion is made complete in the doctrine of HPB and the adepts. KH provides a poignant assessment of this subject, including the accusation of heresy risked by those Buddhists who would seek to expand on the skandhas by suggesting or implying the existence of an immortal transmigrant. Or I would say even just to utter the name of that, or to reference that concept, would be a heresy in the Buddhist tradition. This is what KH says about the skandhas. Quote, "It is the group of skandhas that form and constitute the physical and mental individuality we call man, or any being. This group consists in the exoteric teaching of 5 skandhas. We add to them," meaning himself and the brothers, "we add to them 2 more. Okay, now we got 7, right? "We add to them 2 more, the nature and names of which you," and he's writing to AP Senate here, "may learn hereafter. Suffice for the present to let you know that they," these 2 added skandhas, "with and the productive of Sakyaditi, are the heresy or delusion of individuality, and of Attavada, the doctrine of self, both of which, in the case of the 5th principle, the soul, lead to the Maya of heresy." He's referring now to Buddhists who would believe in such a thing as the 2 elements or skandhas that he added to the existing 5. And in the belief in the efficacy of vain rites and ceremonies in prayers and intercessions. End quote. What is truly significant about this quotation is that it supports the conclusion that in truth there is no substantive conflict between the Buddhist dogma of anatta and the views of HPB and the adepts. The Buddhist view is that the 5 skandhas do not comprise a self, since they are all impermanent or mortal in the original etymological meaning, and disintegrate following death. With this, these theosophical writers agree. But since the transmigrating self is made up primarily of the 6th and 7th principles, Buddhi and Atma, which are not recognized within the Buddhist dogma, one can simultaneously agree with the Buddhist dogma regarding the skandhas, yet still maintain the existence of a reincarnating self based on the 2 added skandhas, or principles, that comprise the immortal monad. So that's the terminological issue that we've just discussed. Now we're going to, move on. This is unfortunately a section that I omitted, but I'll read this. Tracing the theosophical usage of the term Bardo. Owing to considerations of time, the bulk of the section on tracing the theosophical use of the term Bardo, which you can find in the study book in my article, will be omitted in this afternoon's presentation. The principal parts of this history essential to the presentation of our topic doctrine are that 1, the Tibetan term Bardo was once used by HPB and the adepts in their published writings, and 2, they understood it to refer to the post-mortem intermediate states, as it is translated in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Additionally, because Kutumi was a resident of Tibet during the 1880s and conversant with the doctrines of Vajrayana Buddhism, it is probable that he was familiar with the Bardo Thodol, though his own perceptions of the post-mortem journey did not completely align with the Tibetan text. Kutumi referred to Bardo simply as, quote, "the period between death and rebirth," end quote. This definition of Bardo aligned with that of his Tibetan contemporary, the Kohan Lama Rinpoche, the chief of the archive registrars of the secret libraries of the Tale and Tashilumpo Lama's Rinpoche, who in a letter to HBB in the early 1880s stated of those who die prematurely through accidents and suicide that, quote, their state is what we call a false bardo. Then there's a hyphen, the period between two incarnations. So that essentially was his view of bardo, but this discussion will continue. Okay, so this led to, the discussion of the term bardo by HBB led to a clarification by Kuthumi on what may be called the esoteric or theosophical teaching of the transition of the deceased or the transmigrant through the post-mortem states. And is the doctrine, the essence of the doctrine that shall hereafter be compared to the corresponding teachings of the Bardo Thodol. This is essentially a nutshell, in Kuthumi's own words, of the entire theosophical process, and it's compact, so there's not a lot of detail here, but it gives you the whole outline. Quote, Bardo is the period between death and rebirth, and may last from a few years to a kalpa. It is divided into 3 sub-periods. 1, when the ego delivered of its mortal coil enters into Kamaloka, the abode of elementaries. This is essentially the moment of death, the bardo of the moment of death in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. 2, when it enters into its gestation state, and we'll get back to this, this is where it doesn't align all that well with the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And 3, when it is reborn in the Rupa Loka of Devashan. Sub-period 1 may last from a few minutes to a number of years. Sub-period number 2 is very long, as you say, longer sometimes than you may even imagine, yet proportionate to the ego's spiritual stamina. And sub-period 3 lasts in proportion to the good karma, after which the monad is again reincarnated. And this will be unpacked a little bit more as we go on. So I would encourage you to read, if you're interested, the section on the theosophical usage of the term bardo in the book. It's mostly historical, but it's quite interesting. So now what we want to do is we want to sort of examine one by one each of these sub-periods, the term that's used by HBB and the Mahatmas. 1, 2, 3, as in correlation to the Bardos 1, 2, 3. So this is the theosophical sub-periods. It may appear at first glance that Kuthumi's use of the single term bardo as being simply, quote, the period between death and rebirth is inconsistent with the triple bardo components of the post-mortem states as set forth in the Bardo Thodol. As we have seen, that text enumerates not just 3 bardos in those states, but rather a total of 6 bardos, 3 during excarnate existence from death to rebirth, and also another 3 during incarnate existence from birth to death. Yet it must be kept in mind regarding the use of the term bardo among Buddhists in Tibet that there is, in addition to the technical or ritual usage among those familiar with the Bardo Thodol, a more popular or shorthand usage in which bardo is used as a generic term for the gap or the in-between, which is the little translation of bardo from the Tibetan, of the post-mortem states between 2 incarnations. We saw this usage appear in the explanation to Western readers by the scholar Gohan Lama Rinpoche, who, like Kuthumi, referred to bardo simply as, quote, the period between 2 incarnations. The more significant fact is that, like the 3 bardos that are the focus of the Bardo Thodol, Kuthumi describes 3 sub-periods as the post-mortem states of the Bardo, or the states between incarnations. While it cannot be said that the three Tibetan post-mortem Bardos necessarily correspond to the three sub-periods of Kuthumi and the other theosophical writers, certain correlations are apparent. So now we're going to get into the first, we'll be talking now about the first sub-period. Death and entry into Kamaloka. In this first of the three theosophical sub-periods, there is no clear reference to an inner ground luminosity, which is the central focus of the Chikai Bardo of the Bardo Thodol. But no clear reference to this luminosity in the theosophical literature does not necessarily mean that the deceased does not experience this, only that it is not articulated anywhere in the literature generated by the adepts or HPB about the first sub-period. There is, however, wording suggestive of this luminosity. K.H. wrote that, quote, "No man dies insane or unconscious, as some physiologists assert. Even a madman or one in a fit of delirium tremens will have his instant of perfect lucidity at the moment of death, though unable to say so to those present." End quote. And HBB asserted that, quote, "At the solemn moment of every death, every man, even when death is sudden, sees the whole of his past life marshaled before him in its minutest detail. For one short instant, the personal becomes one with the individual and all-knowing ego." End quote. Which I take to be, in a sense, a temporary fusion of the seventh principle, Atma, with the lower principles at that moment of death. Moreover, as we see clear references made by Kuthumi and HBB to the related post-mortem phenomenon of a review of one's life, this phenomenon is also alluded to in the Bardo Thodol. Consistent with HPB's assertion above, Kuthumi adds that, quote, "Yet from the last pulsation, from and between the last throbbing of his heart and the moment when the last spark of animal heat leaves the body, the brain thinks and the ego lives over, in those few brief seconds, his whole life over again." End quote. Beyond this, there's not much discussion by the adepts or HPB about the actual moment of death and its effects. As to the time frames, Kuthumi wrote that, quote, "The rule is that a person who dies a natural death will remain from a few hours to several short years within the Earth's attraction." In other words, in the Kamaloka. End quote. He added that, quote, "When man dies, his second, Linga Sharira, and third, Jivatma, principles die with him. The lower triad disappears, and the fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh principles form the surviving quaternary." Now keep in mind, we've got this odd arrangement where while we're incarnate, the higher triad and the lower quaternary is, the Atma Buddhi Manas, the higher triad, and the lower quaternary. Those are the terms that are used. Quaternary. In the death state, the quaternary is the four principles that survive after the death of the lower three. So just have to keep that in mind as you're going through this and not get confused. This is not inconsistent with the dissolution process, the death and the so forth of the lower three. This is not inconsistent with the dissolution process of the outer and inner bodily elements described in the Bardo Thodol. Once the lower three principles have died, and thus have separated from the remaining higher four principles, these four principles then exist together temporarily in Kamaloka. And this is a longer quote here from K.H. Quote, "Thenceforth, it is a death struggle between the upper, 6th and 7th principles and the lower, 4th and 5th principles, dualities." All right? So you've got two teams here, 6 and 7 principles and 4 and 5 principles, and they enter in this kama loka, in this death, post-mortem state, they enter into a death struggle. And we'll see how that works here. If the upper wins, he goes on, the sixth principle, having attracted itself the quintessence of good from the 5th. Okay, so if the 6th and 7th principles win, the victor there reaches and somehow attracts to itself, the Atma Buddhi attracts to itself the good from the 5th principle. Okay? Its nobler affections, its saintly, though they be earthly, aspirations, and the most spiritualized portions of its mind. Then follows its divine elder, the 7th principle, into the gestation state. And the 5th and the 4th remain in association as an empty shell. And here we refer back again to the spiritualism shell. I think he means here that what remains of the 5th and the 4th are survive in Kamaloka for a while, because there's now some element of the 5th that's been removed from it. So it's not the entire 4th and 5th that remain there and dissolve over time while the 6th and 7th goes on. In fact, it's the 6th and 7th and some higher portion of the 5th. So that means that the 5th that survives with the 4th is not a whole 5th. It's some percentage. We don't know how much. Like the 1st through the 3rd principles that all die together at death, the 4th and 5th principles, once having lost the karmic struggle with the 6th and 7th principles, and thus temporarily existing as a shell, will also gradually dissolve. While there are those decedents whose 6th and 7th principles lose this struggle, okay, we learn from the adepts and HPB that these constitute a minority of beings, a small minority of beings, in fact. It may be interesting to follow the fate of such beings and those few who are destined for the state referred to as avicii, or annihilation. But for our purposes, we concentrate here on the majority of cases and follow the 6th and 7th principles, the immortal monad, through the transition process from death to rebirth. Adding to the specifics of what the deceased undergoes immediately after death, HPB stated that, quote, "After death, before the spiritual eyes of the soul, begins a performance according to a program learned and very often unconsciously composed by ourselves. The practical carrying out of correct beliefs or of illusions which have been created by ourselves." And when I read that, of course, my mind went right back to the Bardo Thodol about the constant reminders of the wrathful and peaceful deities being psychological projections of oneself, created by oneself, by one's own mind. It is unclear whether this program described by HPB is equivalent to the death struggle between 7th, 6th, and 4th, 5th principles described by Kutumi. But HPB's description replicates wording that appears throughout the Bardo Thodol regarding the confrontation of the deceased with the 100 peaceful and wrathful deities as being projections of, and thus created by, one's own psyche. Specifically discussing post-mortem dreams, HPB notes that, quote, "After the dissolution of the body, there commences for it, the ego, a period of full awakened consciousness, or a state of chaotic dreams, or an utterly dreamless sleep, undistinguishable from annihilation. And these are the three kinds of post-mortem sleep. In these first two types of post-mortem sleep, the deceased or the spiritual ego would be capable of experiencing the confrontation with simulacra along the lines of the Tibetan peaceful and wrathful deities. And that confrontation may well correspond to the death struggle between the seventh, sixth, and fourth, fifth principles referred to above by Kuthumi. HPB does not, however, explain whether the dreamless sleep constitutes or relates to the beginning of the gestation state within the Kamaloka, following which the spiritual ego enters Devachan. Unfortunately, not enough detail on this phase of the post-mortem states is provided by either HPB or the adepts to make conclusive determinations about such correspondences. So now we go to the second subperiod, the entry into the gestation state. There is in their descriptions of the post-mortem journey an unambiguous use of the metaphor of procreation by the adepts and HPB, evidenced by their deliberate choice of the term gestation, which is actually used to name the second subperiod, followed by a rebirth from there into the third subperiod of Devachan. Such a procreative paradigm appears nowhere in the Bardo Thodol, which adds to those features of the post-mortem transition from death to rebirth described by the 19th century theosophical writers that do not correspond to the Tibetan text. Furthering this paradigm of the human fetus gestating unconsciously in the womb, Kuthumi asserted that, quote, every ego, the combination of the sixth and seventh principles, which after the period of unconscious gestation is reborn into the Devachan, is of necessity as innocent and pure as a newborn babe, end quote. While technically occurring at the very end of the first subperiod, we are told that the supreme struggle, elsewhere described as the death struggle between seventh, sixth, and fourth, fifth principles, occurs at the threshold of the second subperiod. Kuthumi reminds us that, quote, the supreme struggle occurs between the sixth and seventh principles and the fifth and fourth principles at the threshold of the gestation state. And even after that, when the sixth and seventh, carrying off a portion of the fifth principle, have gone into their akasic samadhi, that's what he referred, that's another term for gestation. Even then, it may happen that the spiritual spoil from the fifth will prove too weak to be reborn into Devachan, in which case it will there and then reclothe itself in a new body, end quote. And there, in the gestation of the second subperiod, will the sixth and seventh, carrying off a portion of the fifth principles, the immortal ego or monad, sleep unconsciously in akasic samadhi for a very long time, based on KH's earlier statement. However long this unconscious sleep may last in gestation, toward the end of that time, the monad begins to return to consciousness and to recollection of the principal events of his or her prior incarnation. Quote, that remembrance will return slowly and gradually toward the end of the gestation to the entity or ego, and fully to the ego at the moment of its entrance into the Devachan. So it begins to wake up right at the end of the second subperiod, and then as it enters Devachan, it wakes up fully. This illustrates another difference between the Theosophical and the Bardo Thodol views of the post-mortem journey. The latter describes 2 points of a decedent's unconsciousness or swoon, which are immediate after the moment of death and again on the cusp separating the second and third bardos. The former, the theosophical view, describes the decedent as losing conscious recollection or memory from the moment of death and replay of his or her prior incarnation to this concluding point of gestation in the second subperiod. Quote, every just disembodied fourfold entity, that's 4, 5, 6, 7, wrote Kuthumi, whether it died a natural or violent death, from suicide or accident, mentally sane or insane, young or old, good or bad, or indifferent, loses at the instant of death all recollection. It is mentally annihilated, it sleeps in its akashic sleep in the Kamaloka. End quote. Slowly awakening from this akashic sleep and regaining its conscious recollection, the immortal ego is readying for rebirth into Devachan. So that was the second subperiod. Now we go to the third subperiod, Devachan. Entry or rebirth into the Rupaloka of Devachan. HPB defines the Sanskrit term Devachan in the Theosophical Glossary as, quote, the dwelling of the gods, a state intermediate between two earth lives into which the ego, Atma Buddhimanas, or the Trinity made one, enters after its separation from Kamarupa and the disintegration of the lower principles on earth. Those would be the lower four. The adepts wrote that Devachan is not a locality, but a state. Once reborn there, the spiritual monad's stay at Devachan is equal or proportionate to the amount of positive karma, good karma, generated in prior incarnations, and most particularly in the single prior incarnation. And Kuthumi used the simile of an oil lamp to convey the thought. Quote, the ego is the wick and the karma is the oil, end quote. He wrote, so the greater the pool of positive karmic oil, the longer will the lamp of Devachan burn. And with regard to the differing experiences of monads in the state of Devachan, it is important to understand that, quote, as no two men, not even two photographs of the same person, nor yet two leaves resemble line for line each other, so no two states in Devachan are alike, end quote. That was Kuthumi speaking. Described in general terms, however, Devachan is a temporary state in which the immortal ego, the transmigrant, exists in pristine happiness. Kuthumi describes it this way, quote, of course it is a state, one, so to say, of intense selfishness, during which an ego reaps the reward of his unselfishness on earth. He is completely engrossed in the bliss of all his personal earthly affections, preferences, and thoughts, and gathers in the fruit of his meritorious actions. No pain, no grief, nor even the shadow of a sorrow comes to darken the bright horizon of his unalloyed happiness. For it is a state of perpetual maya. Since the conscious perception of one's personality on earth is but an evanescent dream, that sense will be equally that of a dream in the Devachan, only 100-fold intensified. So much so, indeed, that the happy ego is unable to see through the veil the evils, sorrows, and woes to which those it loved on earth may be subjected. It lives in that sweet dream with its loved ones, whether gone before or yet remaining on earth. It has them near itself, as happy, as blissful, and as innocent as the disembodied dreamer in himself. And yet, apart from rare visions, the denizens of our gross planet feel it not. End quote. Sounds like a nice place. Toward the end of the Immortal Ego's stay at Devachan, when its karmic oil has been exhausted, it prepares for rebirth not unlike a person prepares for death and a new existence in the post-mortem states. As Kutumi writes, as physical existence has its cumulative intensity from infancy to prime, and its diminishing energy thenceforward to dotage and death, so the dream life of Devachan is lived correspondentially. End quote. H.P. adds to this that, quote, at the moment he is reborn on earth, the ego, awakening from the state of Devachan, has a prospective vision of the life which awaits him and realizes all the causes that have led to it. He realizes them and sees futurity, sees the future, because it is between Devachan and rebirth that the ego regains his full monastic consciousness. End quote. Thus, the spiritual ego is reincarnated and begins yet another life on earth. So that's the third sub-period of the theosophical view of the transition between death and rebirth. But before moving on, there are two significant points to be made regarding Devachan upon which the mindful student should reflect. The first is that only one's positive karma determines the duration of the spiritual ego's stay in Devachan, and the experience is all blissful without any negative aspects that one might expect to be compensation for one's O-positive karma, negative karma. This is because the immortal ego's O-positive karma is in effect, quote, put on hold during the stay in Devachan, and will instead begin to manifest or take effect, the karma, upon rebirth into physical existence in its next incarnation. Kutumi writes, quote, and while the karma of evil steps aside for the time being to follow him in his future earth incarnations, he brings along with him but the good karma of his deeds, words, and thoughts into this Devachan, end quote. This temporary stepping aside of one's O-positive or negative karma during Devachan can be compared to the notion in the Bardo Thodol where it's said that, quote, like darkness is destroyed by the light of the sun, the controlling force of past actions, karma, is destroyed by this inner radiance of the path, and liberation is attained. Though the postponement of negative karma cannot reasonably be equated to its destruction, which would not be possible according to Kutumi, who avers that, quote, the law of retribution is the only law that never errs, end quote. The two notions do provide yet another basis for comparison between the Theosophic and Tibetan depictions of the post-mortem journey. The second significant point to remember about Devachan is that the immortal ego is only conscious in any post-mortem state, including Devachan, by virtue of the presence of the arupa manas, or whatever that portion of the fifth principle that the Atma and the Buddhi take with it through its journey. That's the principle of the higher mind. And, quote, some of the more abstract and pure of the mental attributes of the fifth principle. So that's what attaches to the Atma and the Buddhi. And that, in fact, is what makes the entity there, the immortal ego, conscious and self-conscious. This is because the Atma and the Buddhi are in themselves not vehicles of self-conscious awareness. As Kutumi explained, quote, the sixth and seventh principles, apart from the rest, constitute the eternal, imperishable, but also unconscious monad. To awaken in it to life the latent consciousness, especially that of personal individuality, requires the monad plus the highest attributes of the fifth. So without the highest attributes of the fifth, there's no self-awareness or self-conscious. The Atman, the Buddhi, exist in a state of enlightened consciousness, I suppose, but there's no self-consciousness involved. You have to have that element of the fifth, which I found rather striking. This profound fact reflects again the principle earlier discussed of the Buddhist dogma of anatta, or no self, and the corresponding emphasis placed on mind throughout the Bardo Thodol. So at this point now, I want to transfer and go into, I want to continue on to the transference of consciousness to another body. This is aside from the three subperiods of the transition from death to rebirth. And this is also not in, or referred to in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, as we know, does have a section on the transference of consciousness before death, immediately prior to death. But in that situation, the consciousness is transferred to a Buddha state, the Buddhakaya, Sambhogakaya, or Nirmanakaya. And this transference of consciousness is something else altogether, but it is so interesting and so relevant to our discussion that I decided to include this here. In our discussion of this topic in part one of this presentation, we identified the several locations within the Bardo Thodol in which consciousness transference was explained and promoted. For the most part, the practice discussed there concerned Pawa, or the transference of consciousness into one of the three kayas, or Buddha states, constituting liberation from the wheel of death and rebirth and no further incarnations. We made reference to another similar practice in our discussion there, not referenced in the Bardo Thodol, that involved the transference of consciousness at the time of death to another physical body, known as Drangjuk Pawa. This esoteric Tibetan technique is similar to, if not the same as, techniques discussed by both the adepts and HPB in their writings about consciousness transference at or near the time of death, and share in common the notion that such techniques are effectively limited to yogins or spiritually advanced initiates when faced with the death of their lower ordinaries. It is true that in both the Bardo Thodol and consciousness transference, natural liberation through recollection of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, reference is made to the assertion that this technique is available to ordinary beings, end quote. Yet the bulk of the teachings in these two texts regarding this technique is actually directed at yogins, or highly realized spiritual masters. Those are terms right out of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. This emphasis in the Tibetan texts is in line with the occult doctrines of the adepts and HPB, which, as a reflection of the immemorial philosophia perennis, allows a departure from the norms of transitioning the post-mortem states experienced by the majority of human beings in favor of pure efficiency, wherein the consciousness of an adept is transferred from one body to another without the interruptions or delays that are normally forced by death and rebirth. This efficiency serves as a benefit to the adept, as that relates to his or her duty and work as a bodhisattva, and consequently also as a benefit to all beings. Remarkably consistent with our subject here, Kutumi made reference to the Tibetan term changcho in this regard, declaring that, this is the quote now from Kutumi, the changcho, an adept who has, by the power of his knowledge and soul enlightenment, become exempt from the curse of unconscious transmigration, may, at his will and desire, and instead of reincarnating reincarnating himself only after bodily death, do so, and repeatedly, during his life if he chooses. He holds the power of choosing for himself new bodies, while in possession of his old form, that he generally preserves for purposes of his own." End quote. The goal, therefore, for such an adept is an uninterrupted conscious transmigration that allows for continuous awareness or consciousness through the process of death and relocation, or perhaps reappearance, rather than rebirth. HBB added regarding this practice that the adept has several choices. She wrote that an adept can avail himself of an entirely new physical body, whether that of a newly born infant or, as Samachakara is reported to have done with the body of a dead Raja, by entering a deserted sheath and living in it as long as he chooses. This is what is called continuous existence, end quote. This allows for the magnanimous work of such adepts to be uninterrupted and obviates the necessity of years of spiritual retraining. The discussion of techniques of consciousness transference at or near the moment of death in both parts 1 and 2 of this presentation was included to illustrate one of the most striking parallels pertaining to death and eschatology between the Tibetan Book of the Dead as a whole and the corresponding doctrines of the adepts and HBB. As a general rule, these arcane techniques of consciousness transference lay far beyond the abilities of the vast majority of those human beings who routinely make the transition from death to rebirth, and the varying phenomena they experience in the post-mortem bardos, or intermediate states. So, since our primary focus here has been and continues to be on this vast majority of human beings who regularly traverse the night of post-mortem states between death and rebirth, a summary listing of the similarities and dissimilarities between the two systems, that of the Bardo Thodol and that of the adepts in HBB, together with a few cautious conclusions, shall occupy our attention upon our return. And now I think perhaps, was it too early to take a tea break or not? Okay.